So welcome to video 2 in our series on the subjunctive as we continue to cut this big elephant up in little pieces. And today's piece is about the subordinate noun clause. So a clause contains a subject and a verb. Absent one of those things, it's not a clause. Pretty simple. Okay. So now what's a subordinate clause? Well, a clause becomes subordinate only because of its relationship to the main clause. And that'll become a little bit clearer when we get into our examples. And finally, a subordinate noun clause is a clause that's basically acting as a big direct object. And this big direct object answers the question what, which is posed by the verb in the main clause. For example, yo quiero que el sargento lo explique. Okay, so yo quiero, I want, is the main clause. And the second part of it, que el sargento lo explique, answers the question, what do I want? I want that the sergeant explains it. So for us English speakers, that would actually be translated, I want the sergeant to explain it. Because English prefers to use the infinitive to explain in that second part of that sentence. But Spanish doesn't do that. Okay, each part of this Spanish sentence, both of these clauses have their own subject and their own conjugated verb. And sometimes I think that might be what trips some of us up with this subjunctive, because it doesn't follow the same pattern as English. So now that we understand what a subordinate noun clause is, that's part one. Part two of this is what kind of verb is in that main clause that will trigger the use of the subjunctive in the subordinate noun clause. So we're going to use an acronym to remember the types of verbs that trigger the requirement for the use of the subjunctive in that second part of the sentence, that subordinate noun clause. And those of you that went to any type of academic Spanish training might remember this as weirdo, W-E-I-R-D-O. And each one of those letters stands for a category of a verb that will trigger this use of the subjunctive in the subordinate noun clause. So the W stands for verbs of wanting, wishing, hoping, etc., things like that. The E stands for verbs of emotion, and many of these are reflexive verbs. The I stands for impersonal expressions of wishing, wanting, requesting, doubting, and many of these begin with es and then some adjective afterwards. The R in weirdo would stand for verbs of requesting, asking, or causing. The D stands for verbs of doubt, denial, or negation. And then finally the O stands for ojalá que, which we actually covered under video 1 if you remember. So you guys already have that one taken care of. In a nutshell, if the subject of that main clause is different from the subject in the subordinate noun clause, and the verb in the main clause is one of those triggers that falls into a category of the weirdo acronym that we just gave you, then the verb in the subordinate noun clause has to be in the subjunctive. And if those conditions aren't met, it will never be in the subjunctive, period. End of story. All right, that's your formula. So let's go over several examples here so you can kind of internalize what this whole lesson was about. And to get the examples written out, if you go to our website and under services, fill out that email form and request the examples for video 2, we'll email those to you. So example number 1, esperamos que el sospechoso se rinda. Okay, so we're hoping for something, right? And what are we hoping for? Remember, it answers the question what? We are hoping for the suspect to surrender him or herself. Okay, and we've met what we need to. The subject in the first part of this phrase in the main clause is we hope. The subject in the second clause is different. Okay, esperar is a verb that falls into the weirdo category. Therefore, it triggers the use of the subjunctive in the subordinate noun clause. All right? And it becomes se rinda. Okay? Period. Very easy. Okay, example 2, or B, if you're keeping track alphabetically. El sargento me pidió que yo trabajara el miércoles. So, again, are our conditions met? Different subjects in both sides, right? The sergeant is asking, and again, we're in the past tense now, right? And then I am the subject of the subordinate clause. So, and we look at that first verb, pedir, right? And it is one of those weirdo verbs. So therefore, it triggers the use of the subjunctive in the second clause. Now, later on, not in this video, but later on, we're going to talk about the sequence of tenses and how the first verb relates to the second verb. And here, they're both in the past tense, right? He already asked me this. El sargento pidió que yo trabajara. Okay, so we're talking about something that has already occurred. Number 3, el ladrón no quiere que yo encuentre la evidencia. All right, so here, the only difference is I negated the first part of the sentence. But did that matter at all? In this instance, it didn't. Okay, the robber doesn't want me to find the evidence, so he's still exerting some type of influence over me. All right, verb of influence, weirdo verb. Different subjects in each side of that clause. And of course, the second clause is answering the question, what? What doesn't he want? So all of our conditions are met again. Okay, the next example. Es importante que lleguemos a las 3 para testificar. Now here we have this impersonal expression, right? Es importante. And an impersonal expression is one of those things we talked about that has a specific category under weirdo. All right. So it's exerting some influence in that regard. It is important that we arrive at 3 to testify. Number 5, dudo que la sospechosa lo sepa. Here we're under the category of D in the acronym weirdo, which is the verbs of doubt, denial, or negation. All the conditions have been met. We have different subjects in both sides of these clauses, and we have a verb that is a weirdo verb that triggers the use of the subjunctive in the second clause. Number 6, pídele al testigo que escriba su declaración. So I threw a little something different in here, because if you look at that first part of that sentence, I'm actually giving you a command. I'm saying, hey, request of or ask the witness to write their statement out. But if you look at it just from the formula I told you, we have 2 different subjects in the first part and in the second part. We still have a verb of influence, although my influence is going through you. It's still there, okay, with this weirdo verb pedir. And that triggers the use of the subjunctive in that second part. Number 7, el detective esperaba que el ADN verificara sus sospechas. Now, the only thing I did different here was to shift this into a past time frame, okay? The detective was hoping that the DNA verified his suspicions, okay? The conditions are still being met. All I did was shift it to the past. Number 8, diles que no se vayan, porque la zona es peligrosa. Now, this one I purposely added a little bit more to the sentence to show you that not every verb that follows a weirdo verb that triggers the subjunctive will be in the subjunctive. So look at the sentence. Diles que no se vayan. That's where the subjunctive comes into place. Tell them not to go. And then the rest of the sentence, porque la zona es peligrosa, all right, is more of like an observational thing that the diles in the main clause does not have influence over. So when you state something, make sure that only the verbs that require to be in the subjunctive are in the subjunctive. Now let's look at a couple sentences in which the requirements are not there for the subjunctive. The next one is, es obvio que ellas escondieron las drogas. So all this is an observation. Es obvio that the girls or the women hid the drugs. So there is the conditions for the use of the subjunctive in that second part of the sentence is not present. The next one that we have is quiero arrestarlo yo mismo. I want to arrest him myself. So there's no change of subject. I'm the one that's doing the arresting. I don't want you to arrest somebody. So because of that, arrestar is left in the infinitive, and it's not turned into the subjunctive because there is no change of subject. So the conditions for my subordinate noun clause are not met. To follow on this with this no change of subject, sometimes with a verb of doubt like dudar, some speakers will say a sentence like dudo que yo pueda ir. I doubt that I'll be able to go. Now there's no change of subject between the first part of the main clause and the subordinate noun clause, but they still do that. I'll also tell you that you'll hear many people just say dudo poder ir. I doubt to be able to go. I doubt that I will be able to go. So that's only with these verbs of doubt. Okay, that's just an added little piece that you should be aware of. Finally, I want to spend just a couple minutes under this weirdo category of D, doubt, and speak in particular about these two verbs, creer and dudar. And I'll do it by example. So if I say, I believe that he is guilty, I'm going to say, creo que él es culpable. All right? I believe that he is guilty. So the verb ser in the subordinate noun clause is not in the subjunctive because it's something I believe. Now, if I negate the first part and I say no creo, well, now there's doubt. Okay, so when creer is negated in this circumstance and I say no creo, and I say I don't believe he is guilty, then I would say no creo que él sea culpable. Now, by extension, and I think you know what's coming with this verb dudar, if I say I doubt he is guilty, then what do you think that second verb would be in? Would it be in the subjunctive or would it be in the indicative? It'd be subjunctive, right? Because I'm doubting. Dudo que él sea culpable. But if I negate the doubt and I say I don't doubt that he's guilty, then that verb will have to be in the indicative, right? No dudo que él es culpable. I hope this is making sense with these two verbs, how you can see the opposite of these two changes, whether that follow-on verb in the subordinate noun clause is in the indicative or the subjunctive. So in our next video number 3, we're going to talk about subordinated adjective clauses and how the subjunctive works with them. But until then, look at these model sentences. Change the verbs inside to other weirdo verbs, things that you would normally say during your shift perhaps, and internalize these patterns so that you understand when the subjunctive is necessary. Also, don't forget in that list that you requested us to email you, look at the verbs that would fall under those weirdo categories that are listed on those papers. And also try to memorize those so you know that if you use that in a subordinated noun, in a pattern where there's a subordinated noun clause, then you'll know when to use the subjunctive. Until then, stay safe, keep practicing, and hit that subscribe button.